The fire crackled between them like a living thing, throwing amber light across Anna Prescott's face, and she could feel his eyes on her the way you feel a storm before it arrives, a pressure in the air, a certainty that something was about to break open and change everything forever. The ranger sat across the fire and said nothing, but he never took his eyes off her. She had tried ignoring it. She had tried staring into the flames, counting the sparks that rose and vanished into the black Texas sky, willing her heartbeat back to something reasonable. She had tried cataloging the sounds of the desert night, the distant cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind through scrub brush, the occasional crack of the fire settling into its own coals. None of it worked. Stephen Monroe's gaze was not the kind of thing a person could simply ignore. What made it worse? What made the silence between them a kind of torture she had not anticipated when she had ridden out of Abilene 3 days ago was that she knew what was in his eyes. She had seen it twice now, when she was not supposed to be watching, once at the water crossing where he had steadied her horse without a word, and once when she had been too exhausted to keep her walls up and had wept openly over what she had found at her father's homestead. Both times, when she glanced up and caught him, something in his expression had shifted like a curtain pulled back, raw and unguarded and unmistakably tender. And both times he had gone carefully blank again, the way a man goes blank when he has decided that whatever he is feeling is not something he is permitted to act upon. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to cross the fire and shake him by his wide shoulders and demand to know why he kept looking at her like that if he refused to say a single word that mattered. But she was not that kind of woman. She had been raised to hold herself together, to be composed and practical and useful, and she had been doing that successfully for 26 years. She was not at all certain she could do it for the rest of tonight. "You should sleep," Stephen Monroe said finally, his voice low, the words careful, like a man who has rehearsed a small and deliberately safe thing to say so he would not say the larger dangerous thing. Anna looked at him across the fire. His hat was off, which was rare, and his dark hair was disheveled from the hard riding they had done through the late afternoon. There was a cut along his jaw from the confrontation 2 days ago that she had cleaned herself with strips torn from her petticoat because they had nothing else, and the sight of that small scar made something twist painfully behind her breastbone. "So should you," she said. He turned back to the fire. And she understood, in the way that women understand things that have not been spoken aloud, that neither of them was going to sleep for a very long time. To understand how Anna Prescott and Stephen Monroe came to be sitting on opposite sides of a fire in the middle of the Texas badlands in the spring of 1878, neither of them sleeping, the weight of unspoken things pressing down on the desert night like a physical force, you would have to go back 3 weeks, to the morning Anna stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, with a leather satchel in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and discovered that the life she had traveled 600 miles to claim was already in ruins. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the previous 4 years working as a school teacher in a cramped 2-room schoolhouse in a neighborhood that smelled of coal smoke and river mud. She was good at her work. She loved children with a fierceness that surprised even herself sometimes, the way they looked at the world without the layers of careful damage that adults accumulate, the way they trusted her to help them make sense of things. But St. Louis had begun to feel like a cage with very nice curtains, and when the letter arrived from her father, Thomas Prescott, describing his homestead south of Caldwell and asking if she might consider coming west to help him manage it after his hired hand had departed, she had felt something in her chest unlock. Her father had been in Texas and Kansas territory for 11 years. He was a man of few words and great stubbornness, qualities Anna had inherited in different proportions, and his letters had always been brief and practical. The price of cattle, the state of the range, the names of neighboring ranchers who had proved trustworthy or otherwise. The letter asking her to come had been slightly longer than usual, which she had taken as a sign of how genuinely he needed her. What she had not expected was for him to not be there when she arrived. The station master in Caldwell, a weathered man named Hicks with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, had looked at her with something between pity and discomfort when she gave her father's name and asked for directions to his land. He had told her, in the way men of that era told women difficult news carefully, at a distance, as if bad tidings were contagious, that Thomas Prescott had not been seen in Caldwell for nearly 6 weeks, that there were concerns among the townspeople, and that she might want to speak to the sheriff before making any decisions about riding out to the property alone. The sheriff of Caldwell was a man named Bart Hodges, 50 years old, with the look of someone who had once been sharp and had allowed himself to go soft around the edges. He had confirmed that Thomas Prescott had not been seen, that riders from a neighboring spread owned by a man named Cord Halsey had been spotted near the Prescott land multiple times in recent weeks, and that Cord Halsey was the kind of man whose name made certain conversations go quiet in certain rooms. He had also told her there was nothing he could personally do about it. His jurisdiction ended at the county line, and the Prescott homestead sat just over it, in territory that fell under the purview of the Texas Rangers, to whom he had already sent a wire 3 weeks prior. The Texas Ranger had arrived in Caldwell the same morning Anna did, which she had initially thought was fortunate, and had later come to think of as the kind of coincidence that the universe arranges with a particular intention. His name was Stephen Monroe, and he was 32 years old, and he walked into Bart Hodges's office with the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent years in places where unnecessary motion gets you killed. He was not a large man in the way that outlaws in dime novels are described as large. He was lean and angular, with the kind of quiet physical confidence that has nothing to prove. His badge was pinned to a plain brown vest. His eyes, when he looked at Anna sitting in the chair across from Hodges's desk, were a shade of gray-green that she would spend considerable time afterward failing to describe accurately to herself. "You are Miss Prescott," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, "and you have apparently been sent to look into my father's disappearance." "I have," he said. He sat down in the remaining chair without being invited and took out a small leather notebook. "Tell me about the last letter you received from him." She had told him. She had been precise and thorough because precision was her nature, and she had watched him write in his notebook with a hand that moved quickly and surely, and she had thought, somewhat against her will, that he was the most self-contained person she had ever met. Not cold, that was not the right word. More like a banked fire, something substantial burning low and controlled, and you were aware of the heat even across a significant distance. He had asked her 11 questions in the space of 20 minutes, and then he had told her that he would be riding out to the Prescott homestead the following morning, and that she could accompany him if she chose, but that she should understand the situation might be complicated. "Define complicated," she had said. "Cord Halsey has a history," Stephen Monroe said carefully. "He's acquired land in this region over the past 4 years in ways that the law has found difficult to address directly. Several families have sold and moved on. Others have simply moved on without selling. The implication had sat in the room between them like something with weight. "My father would not simply move on," Anna said. "No," Stephen Monroe said, and something in his voice shifted slightly, something that sounded almost like respect. "From what I have gathered about Thomas Prescott, I do not believe he would." That was the moment she had decided to trust him. Not because of the badge, not because of the competent economy of his questions, but because of the way he said those words. "I do not believe he would," with the kind of conviction that belongs to a man who means what he says and has thought about the cost of meaning it. They had ridden out the next morning. Sheriff Hodges had declined to accompany them past the county line, citing his jurisdiction again, and Anna had thought privately that the word jurisdiction could be made to cover a great deal of reluctance in men who did not wish to involve themselves in difficult things. She had said nothing of this to Stephen Monroe, But when she glanced at him as they rode out of Caldwell and found his expression carrying a particular neutrality that might have concealed a similar thought, she had felt the first small filament of connection stretch between them. The Prescott homestead was a half-day's ride south and east, into country that grew progressively more arid and dramatic as they traveled, the flat grassland giving way to broken terrain of cedar and mesquite, limestone outcroppings rising from red earth, the sky enormous and cloudless, and a shade of blue that seemed almost too saturated to be real. Anna had grown up in Illinois before St. Louis, in landscape that was lush and green and enclosed, and the Texas country felt like something from another world, vast and indifferent and strangely beautiful in a way that required you to adjust all your previous notions of what beautiful meant. Stephen Monroe rode slightly ahead of her for most of the morning, not from any social convention, but because the trail narrowed and he knew the terrain. He pointed out water sources and shade, mentioned the names of landmarks with the ease of someone who had covered this ground before, and spoke very little otherwise. She had found herself studying the set of his shoulders, the way he watched the surrounding country without appearing to watch it, the small adjustments he made to his horse with his knees rather than the reins, and she had been somewhat irritated to notice that she was studying these things. They found the homestead in the early afternoon. The house was still standing, which was something. It was a modest structure built from limestone and cedar timber, the kind of careful, solid construction that spoke of a man who built for permanence. The barn was intact. The water well was intact. The fences were intact. Thomas Prescott was not there, but someone had been through the house recently. Anna had walked through each room with her hands pressed together in front of her, maintaining her composure with a force of will that she could feel the cost of, cataloging what was wrong. Drawers opened and not properly closed. A coffee cup on the table with the dregs of coffee still in it, now dried to a dark film. Her father's rifle missing from above the fireplace. His good boots still by the door. His good boots still by the door. She had stood looking at those boots for a long time. Stephen Monroe had come to stand beside her. He had not said anything immediately. He had looked at the boots, and then he had looked at her face, and then he had said quietly, "He left in a hurry, or he was taken in a hurry. The boots are a good sign, Miss Prescott." "How are they a good sign?" she had said, and her voice had come out steadier than she had expected. "Because a man who walked out of his own life deliberately does not leave his good boots behind," Stephen Monroe said. This was not his choice. Which was both more frightening and somehow more bearable than the alternative, and Anna had understood that he had chosen his words deliberately for precisely that reason, and the gratitude she felt toward him for that specific careful kindness had been overwhelming and entirely inconvenient. They had found other things. In the barn, evidence of a struggle that had been partially cleaned up but not thoroughly. Boot prints in the hard dirt outside, multiple sets, including one very large print, with a distinctive pattern that Stephen Monroe had crouched to study for a long time before writing something in his notebook. Down at the fence line, a section that had been cut and repaired inexpertly, suggesting someone had come through and tried to conceal that they had done so. Stephen Monroe had shown her all of it without editorializing, letting her look and draw her own conclusions, and she had thought that this was an unusual quality in a man of this time and place, this willingness to let her see and know and understand rather than filtering reality through a layer of protective condescension. "Halsey," she had said. It was not a question. "Likely," he had said. "I want to look at the neighboring parcels tomorrow. There's a man east of here named Calloway who has been watching Halsey's operation for some time. I need to speak with him." Anna said. He had looked at her. "We need to speak with him," she said. "This is my father, Ranger Monroe. I am not going to wait at a homestead while you investigate." There had been a pause. She had braced for an argument, for the standard arguments about safety and impropriety, and the things that women ought and ought not to do, arguments she had been receiving in various forms her entire adult life. "You can ride," he said. "I have been riding since I was 7 years old," she said. Another pause. Then, "We leave at first light." They had stayed that first night at the homestead. She in the house, he in the barn with the horses, which was both practical and, she had to acknowledge, a form of consideration for her reputation that she found quietly touching in a man who struck her as entirely unpractical about most social conventions. She had not slept well. She had lain in her father's narrow bed smelling the particular smell of his house cedar and tobacco, and something that was simply him, the irreducible smell of a parent's space, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the good boots by the door, and tried very hard not to think about what the dark alternatives might mean. In the morning, Stephen Monroe had been up before dawn, the horses saddled, a small fire built outside with coffee already made in a tin pot he had produced from his saddlebag. He had handed her a tin cup without ceremony, which she had accepted, and they had drunk coffee in the pale early light before the sun was fully up, not talking, and it had been the most companionable silence she had experienced in recent memory. The days that followed had layered themselves into a particular rhythm. They rode, they investigated, they gathered the scattered pieces of a situation that grew more complicated and more dangerous with each new piece. Calloway, the neighboring rancher, had been a gruff and initially reluctant source of information, who had opened up gradually under the combination of Stephen Monroe's patient precision and Anna's talent for asking questions that sounded simple but weren't. He had told them about Halsey's operation, the way land had been acquired, the men Halsey employed, the name of a man called Driscoll who served as Halsey's primary instrument of persuasion in situations where conventional persuasion had not proven sufficient. Driscoll. The name had a weight to it when Calloway said it. They had found 2 other families who had sold under pressure. A couple named Whitman who had moved to a small house in Caldwell and spoke of Driscoll in whispers, and an older woman named Mrs. Garner whose husband had left their spread under circumstances she described with a careful blankness that told on a more than any detailed account could have. Through all of this, Stephen Monroe had said very little to Anna that was not directly related to the investigation. He was professionally courteous, consistently capable, and watched the country around them with a vigilance that she had come to find reassuring in the way that you find a reliable thing reassuring a bridge that holds, a well that does not run dry. But there was nothing personal in any of it, nothing that crossed the line between the professional and the human, except the eyes. She had begun noticing it by the second day. The way he would look at her when she was not, apparently, watching. The way that when she turned quickly and caught him, something flickered across his face before he looked away. It was not intrusive or presumptuous. It was not the look that certain men gave women as a form of assessment or possession. It was something else, something that made her feel seen in a way that was deeply uncomfortable and deeply wanted at the same time, and she was not at all sure what to do with that. On the third day, the situation had broken open. They had ridden out to the eastern boundary of the Prescott land to look at the terrain and found, instead, 3 of Halsey's men waiting not particularly hidden, which was itself a message, the brazenness of men who feel sufficiently protected to forego the pretense of subtlety. The man in the center had introduced himself as Driscoll. He was a large man, Driscoll, the kind of large that is not incidental but cultivated, a man who had understood early in life that size was a kind of argument that required no further elaboration. He had a flat, pale face and small, pale eyes that were cold in a way that made Anna think of still water in winter, something that looked calm but was not. He had addressed Stephen Monroe exclusively, not acknowledging Anna at first, which had told her several things about him, none of them good. "Mr. Halsey has expressed an interest in speaking with Miss Prescott about the disposition of this property," Driscoll had said. His voice was surprisingly even, a voice trained to sound reasonable in situations where it was delivering something entirely unreasonable. "Miss Prescott has expressed no corresponding interest in speaking with Mr. Halsey," Stephen Monroe said. His voice was even as well, but there was something underneath it, something very controlled and very cold, and Anna had instinctively kept her own expression still. "Mr. Halsey is a reasonable man," Driscoll said. "He's prepared to offer a fair price." "Miss Prescott is not here to sell," Stephen Monroe said. "She is here to find her father. If your employer knows anything about Thomas Prescott's whereabouts, I would suggest, very strongly, that he make that information available through official channels immediately." Driscoll had smiled. It did not reach his pale eyes. "Mr. Halsey doesn't know anything about that unfortunate situation." "Then we have nothing to discuss," Stephen Monroe said. There had been a moment, a long, suspended moment, in which Anna had been acutely aware of several things simultaneously. The distance between herself and the nearest cover, the fact that Driscoll's two companions had not moved but were entirely alert, the particular quality of Stephen Monroe's stillness beside her, which was not the stillness of uncertainty, but the stillness of a man who has already thought through the next 4 moves and is waiting to see which one becomes necessary. Driscoll had looked at Anna directly then, for the first time. "Miss Prescott," he said, with the careful politeness of a man who wants you to understand that the politeness is a choice he is making and could unmake, "your father's land is going to belong to Mr. Halsey one way or another. It would be a shame for you to have come all this way for nothing." "I came for my father," Anna said, and her voice came out steady and clear, which she was proud of, "and I will not leave without him." Something shifted in Driscoll's pale eyes, a recalibration. He had expected, she thought, a different kind of woman. They had ridden away from that encounter without incident, but Stephen Monroe had changed after it in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, more watchful, more deliberate in their routing, changing the approach to any location they returned to. He had said, that evening over a fire he had built in a different spot from the previous nights, "We need to find your father before Halsey decides to change his approach." "You think they have him," Anna said. She had been thinking it for days but had not said it plainly. "I think there is a good chance they know where he is," Stephen Monroe said. "Whether they have him directly or whether they drove him off his land and he is somewhere in the territory, I don't know yet." He paused. "I have sent a wire to Austin for additional rangers. They will take several days to arrive. Until then, I need you to do exactly as I say when I say it without question. Can you do that?" She had looked at him across the fire. "I can do that," she said, "but I want you to do something for me in return." He waited. "Tell me the truth," she said. "All of it, whatever you find. I don't need to be protected from information, Ranger Monroe. I need to be informed." Another of those pauses that she had come to understand were not hesitation but consideration. The pause of a man who does not speak before he has decided what he actually thinks. "Agreed," he said. They had gone on that way for several more days, moving carefully through the territory, building their understanding of Halsey's operation, sending wires when they passed through small settlements, gathering the pieces. They had found evidence that Thomas Prescott had been at Halsey's main ranch. The distinctive large boot print from the barn had appeared again in the yard of the ranch, visible from the road. They had found a man named Jarvis, a former Halsey employee who had departed under bad terms, who was willing to talk, and who confirmed that Halsey had been holding certain individuals at his property as a form of leverage against land negotiations. They had found a great deal, and through all of it, the days had accumulated between them like sediment, layer on layer, building something Anna could feel but not yet name. The way he made sure she ate when she forgot to. The way he had ridden back half a mile on a particularly brutal afternoon when her horse threw a shoe, rather than leaving her to walk or waiting ahead impatiently. The way he had, on the 4th evening, told her something about himself entirely voluntarily, and without being asked, a brief mention of having grown up in Central Texas, of a sister he was close to, of having joined the Rangers at 21 because he believed in the idea of law in a place that did not yet have enough of it, and how that small voluntary disclosure had felt like being handed something of value. She had told him things too, about the schoolhouse in St. Louis, about her mother, who had died when Anna was 15, which had been the fracture point of her childhood, the before and the after. About how she had developed the habit of composure as a survival mechanism after that loss and had never entirely been able to put it down again. He had listened with the full quality of attention he gave to everything, and he had said, simply and without embellishment, "Composure is not the same as not feeling. You know that." She had looked at him. "Yes," she had said, "I know that." They had not spoken again for some time after that, but the silence had been different from the previous silences, warmer somehow. The silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are quietly acknowledging the weight of it. On the sixth day, they had ridden into trouble. Not the visible, declarative trouble of Driscoll and his men at the fence line, but the more dangerous kind, unexpected, sudden, and requiring rapid decisions in conditions that did not permit careful thought. They had been cutting across the northwest corner of Halsey's range, moving toward a dried creek bed that Jarvis had mentioned as a possible location where supplies were moved, when 3 shots had cracked out from somewhere in the cedar breaks to their left. Not aimed, or not well-aimed warning shots, perhaps, or simply bad shooting, but close enough that Anna's horse had shied violently, and she had been thrown before she could collect the animal. She had landed hard in the red dirt, and for a terrible moment the world had been nothing but impact and dust and the thundering of hooves. Then hands had reached her, Stephen Monroe's hands, because he had been off his own horse before she had fully stopped moving toward her with a speed that seemed impossible given the distance between them a moment before, and she had been pulled upright and behind a limestone outcrop, and his body had been between her and the direction of the shots, and she had understood in that instant that he had placed himself there deliberately, that this was not accidental, that whatever else Stephen Monroe was or was not, he would put himself between her and harm without thinking about it, and that this was a form of declaration more direct and unambiguous than anything he had said in the past 6 days. The shots had not continued, either bad shooting or warning or someone who had decided not to escalate. They had stayed behind the limestone for 15 minutes while Stephen Monroe watched the cedar breaks with a focused patience, and then he had said quietly, "They are gone," and helped her to her feet. His hands had lingered for a moment longer than necessary at her arm, steadying her, making certain she was steady, and then he had stepped back and the space between them had returned to something appropriate and impersonal, and she had wanted to close it again immediately, which was alarming. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My pride mainly," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Your horse is 20 yards east. He seems fine." "Good," she said. "He cost more than my pride." The almost smile again. It happened rarely, and she had taken to cataloging the instances with the same careful attention she had once given to marking pages in books. Her elbow was bruised badly from the fall, and there was a long scrape along her forearm from the rough ground. That evening, when she tried to clean the scrape with water from their canteen, she could not quite reach the worst part of it, and after watching her struggle for a moment, Stephen Monroe had said, without looking at her, "Let me." He had cleaned and wrapped the scrape with the careful thoroughness of a man who has dealt with field injuries before, his hands very gentle, his eyes focused on the work. She had watched his face in profile and thought that she was in serious difficulty and had been for several days, and that the most rational course of action would be to acknowledge this privately to herself and do absolutely nothing about it. She was not at all certain she had the fortitude for the most rational course of action. The night of the fire, the night that had begun this account, the night that sat across everything else like a fault line between what had been and what was going to be, that was the 7th night. They had received word through a contact in the settlement of Red Fork that Halsey was planning to move Thomas Prescott. Whatever arrangement Halsey had been maintaining, wherever Thomas Prescott was being held or coerced, was about to change, and the change would almost certainly not be in Thomas Prescott's favor. They needed to act, and they needed to act before the additional Rangers arrived from Austin, which meant acting with 2 people and whatever they had. They had ridden hard through the late afternoon and made camp in the badlands southeast of Halsey's main ranch, close enough to move quickly in the morning, far enough to be out of sight and earshot. The fire was small and carefully placed. The night was clear and cold, the stars extraordinary, the desert around them present and silent. And Stephen Monroe sat across the fire and said nothing, but he never took his eyes off her. Anna had endured it for a full hour before she simply could not endure it any longer. "What are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet of a man who does not want to answer, but the particular quiet of a man choosing his words with more care than usual. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "about tomorrow." "And what are you thinking about tomorrow?" "That it is going to require you to be very careful," he said, "and that I would very much prefer that nothing happened to you." The firelight moved across his face. She watched him. "That is a professional concern," she said carefully, testing. He looked up from the fire and met her eyes, and for once he did not look away. "It is not entirely a professional concern," he said. The silence after that was enormous. The desert held them in it like something cupped in still hands. "Stephen," she said, and the use of his given name was itself a statement, the first time she had used it, and she saw the slight change in his expression that meant he heard that too. "Don't," he said, not coldly, almost painfully. "Anna, don't ask me to say something I have been extremely careful not to say, tonight of all nights when tomorrow is what it is." "Why not tonight?" she said. "Because if I say it tonight," he said, and his voice had dropped, gone rough at the edges, "and something happens tomorrow to either of us, then I will have said it and not had the chance to." He stopped, looked at the fire. "I have not been careful my whole life," he said more quietly, "and this is not the right time." "When is the right time?" she said. He looked up at her again. "After," he said, "if you will let me, after." She held his gaze across the fire. This man who had watched her for 7 days with something in his eyes that she had been trying and failing to ignore. This man who had put himself between her and gunfire without hesitation. Who had cleaned the scrape on her arm with hands too gentle for the rest of him. Who had asked her 11 careful questions in a sheriff's office. And then chosen, again and again, to treat her as someone fully capable of knowing and surviving difficult truths. "After," she agreed. He looked at the fire again, but the quality of the silence had changed entirely. Something had been said without being said, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them like something warm. Anna lay down on her bedroll and watched the stars and thought that tomorrow was coming fast, and that she needed to sleep, and that she was in love with Stephen Monroe, and that this was both entirely inconvenient and completely, irreversibly true. She slept better than she had any night of the previous week. Morning came cold and gray and quick, the way mornings do in the desert when you need them to be slow. Anna had been up before first light, having slept well and woken to the peculiar clarity that sometimes follows a difficult admission, the relief of a thing settled, even temporarily, even with everything else still open and unresolved. Stephen Monroe was already awake. He had been awake, she suspected, most of the night, sitting with the watchful patience that was simply part of how he existed in the world, the kind of vigilance that does not come from anxiety but from habit and responsibility and the deep understanding of what the country around you can contain. He handed her coffee without speaking. Their hands did not touch, but the intentionality of the gesture was somehow more charged than contact would have been. They ate quickly and in silence and broke camp with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this together long enough to know each other's movements without having to discuss them. Then they rode. The plan was straightforward in concept if not in execution. Jarvis had told them that there was a root cellar beneath a secondary outbuilding on Halsey's property where sensitive matters were sometimes housed. The main ranch would have at least 5 or 6 of Halsey's men at any given time. The additional rangers from Austin were still 2 days out. Going in directly was not an option, but Jarvis had also told them about a road that Halsey used for supply runs to the settlement at Red Fork, a road that passed through a narrow cut in the limestone ridges approximately 4 miles from the ranch. If they could intercept whatever movement Halsey was planning for Thomas Prescott, if they could take possession of the situation before the man was moved to somewhere more permanent and less findable, they had a chance. It was not a good plan by most standards. It was the plan they had. They reached the limestone cut by mid-morning and found a position above it on the eastern ridge, a narrow shelf of rock screened by cedar that gave them a clear view of the road while keeping them out of sight. Then they waited. Waiting in high tension is its own particular experience, the body simultaneously alert and still, every sense at a heightened pitch, time behaving in strange and nonlinear ways. Anna had crouched on that limestone shelf next to Stephen Monroe and watched the empty road and been aware, throughout all of it, of him beside her, the heat of him in the cool morning air, the steadiness of his breathing, the fact that at some point his hand had moved to rest against hers on the rock between them, not clasped, just touching, present, and she had not moved her hand away. They heard them before they saw them. A wagon moving quickly, 2 riders flanking it, then a 3rd rider ahead. 4 men total. Thomas Prescott, if he was in that wagon, was significantly outnumbered. So, objectively, were they. Stephen Monroe had a plan for this, too. He had thought it through thoroughly before dawn and explained it to her in detail. Because that was the kind of man he was, a man who believed in her capacity to understand and execute, rather than simply comply with instructions she had not been given the reasoning for. She was positioned 20 yards to his left with a clear sightline to the road. She would not need to fire her weapon. She had one, a small Colt pocket revolver she had carried from St. Louis, a practical decision made before she had fully understood what practical meant in this context. Her role was to be visible at the right moment, to create the impression that there were more people on those ridges than there actually were, to be a distraction while Stephen Monroe made his move from the right. It had worked. Not smoothly, not without several terrifying seconds during which everything seemed to teeter on the wrong edge. But the ranger's badge and the authority it carried had been enough to make the situation pause. And Anna's appearance on the ridge above had created exactly the uncertainty that Stephen Monroe had counted on. And Driscoll's men had made the calculation that they could not know how many rangers were positioned around them. And in that window of uncertainty, Stephen Monroe had been very clear and very direct and very credible about the consequence of a wrong decision, and the wagon had stopped. Thomas Prescott had been in that wagon. Alive, bruised, furious in the particular way of a man who has been constrained against his will for 3 weeks, but alive and essentially unharmed. He had taken one long look at Stephen Monroe, and then he had looked at his daughter, and something had moved across his weathered face that Anna had not expected, not just relief, but recognition. The recognition of a father who sees in the context of his daughter's face that something has changed in the world as he understood it. "Anna," he had said, his voice rough. "Papa," she had said, and crossed to him, and the composure she had maintained for 7 days cracked open completely for the second time, and she had held him for a long time in the middle of that road with the limestone ridges above them, and the cedar scenting the air, and Stephen Monroe standing a respectful and deliberate distance away, watching the surrounding country with his hat brimmed down and his hand near his sidearm, keeping watch while she allowed herself to feel what she had not permitted herself to feel for a week. They had ridden back to the homestead. Halsey's men had been disarmed and sent back to the ranch with a message from Stephen Monroe that was brief and unambiguous. The Texas Rangers were aware of the operation. Additional Rangers were incoming, and the wisest possible decision Cord Halsey could make was to have his attorney present and cooperative before they arrived. It was not a threat. It was a description of a reality that was about to arrive regardless of preference. Thomas Prescott, once he had been cleaned up and fed and given several hours of sleep in his own bed, had proved to be exactly the man his letters had suggested, sharp and stubborn, and not at all interested in being handled carefully. He had given Stephen Monroe a thorough account of everything that had occurred since Halsey's men had first arrived at his fence line 6 weeks before, precise and detailed in the way of a man who has been cataloging injustice with the patient intention of eventually presenting it as evidence. The story he told was damning, and it was not only about Thomas Prescott. It was about 5 other families in the territory who had faced versions of what he had faced, some of whom had yielded and some of whom had not. And the ones who had not were people Anna intended to make certain were not forgotten in whatever official accounting followed. Stephen Monroe had spent 2 days writing reports, sending wires, and preparing the documentation that would accompany the Rangers from Austin when they arrived. He had been methodical and thorough, and had included the testimony of every person they had spoken to, the Whitmans and Mrs. Garner and Calloway and Jarvis, building something comprehensive and prosecutable. On the second evening back at the homestead, Thomas Prescott had sat on his porch in the last of the day's light, looking at his land with the expression of a man reclaiming something, and Stephen Monroe had joined him, and Anna had watched the 2 of them from the kitchen window, her father and the ranger talking in the quiet, direct way of men who respect each other, and she had felt something settle in her chest with the solidity of a stone finding the bottom of deep water. She had gone out to the porch eventually and sat in the remaining chair, and the 3 of them had watched the sun go down over the Texas country, the sky turning from blue to orange to a deep and magnificent purple, and her father had looked at her at some point with that same look of recognition from the road and said nothing at all, which was his most particular way of saying a great deal. The Rangers from Austin arrived on the 3rd day back, 3 of them, experienced and efficient, and prepared with the jurisdiction and documentation to make Halsey's situation considerably worse than it had been before. The operation was not going to be resolved overnight. These things never were, not in 1878, not with a man like Halsey who had money and connections and attorneys, but the shape of it had changed definitively, and Thomas Prescott's land was not going anywhere, and the families who had been displaced were now part of a legal process that at least acknowledged that they had been wronged. It was not perfect justice. Anna understood that. She had grown up enough to understand the distance between what justice ought to be and what it could achieve in practice, the slow and imperfect machinery of it. But it was something. It was more than nothing, which was what it had been before. Stephen Monroe was preparing to leave. This was, of course, always going to be true. He was a ranger. He had been sent here for a purpose, and the purpose had been accomplished, at least sufficiently that others could carry it forward, and there were certainly other places, other wires from other sheriffs, other families in difficulty in other parts of the territory. That was his life, and she had known that from the beginning. She had known it from the beginning, and she had gone and fallen in love with him anyway, which she supposed said something about her judgment, or possibly about the impossibility of governing these things by purely rational means. He had told her he was leaving on a Monday morning. He had told her formally, standing near the barn while her father worked the horses inside, his hat in his hands, looking at her with that careful steadiness that was entirely characteristic. "The men from Austin have what they need," he said. "I need to go back." "I know," she said. "Your father will be all right," he said. "The legal process will take time, but the land is not in question anymore." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet. He turned his hat in his hands once. "Anna," he said. "You told me after," she said. "It's after." Something moved across his face. "I did say that." "You did," she said. "And I am aware that you need to leave, and I am not going to ask you to. I am not going to make this difficult. But you said after, and it is after, and I think you should say whatever it is that you have been not saying for the past 10 days. He looked at her for a long moment with the gray-green eyes that she had spent considerable effort describing to herself inaccurately, and then he said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic, "I would like to come back." "All right," she said. "Not just to check on the legal situation," he said. "I know that," she said. "When I come back," he said, and his voice was careful, but underneath the carefulness it was warm and certain, the warmth of a banked fire when you finally move close enough to feel it. "I want to come back to you specifically." Anna looked at him standing in the morning light outside her father's barn, this precise and watchful and impossibly contained man with his hat in his hands, and thought that he was the most extraordinary person she had encountered in 26 years of living, and that she was absolutely not going to let him leave without telling him so. "Stephen Monroe," she said, "I have been in love with you since the 4th day, and I am reasonably confident you have been in love with me for approximately the same amount of time, and I would appreciate it very much if you would come back." He was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "The 4th day," he said. "You insisted on going back for the horse," she said. "That was not," he started. "I know exactly what it was," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then something in his face simply let go, the careful, controlled holding that had been there since the first morning, the 10 days of deliberate precision. And what was underneath it was everything she had glimpsed in the firelight, and the water crossing, and the moment on the road with the limestone ridges around them. Something absolute and unguarded and certain. He crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her in the morning light outside her father's barn in Texas in the spring of 1878, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who has made a decision with his whole self and is not interested in half measures, and Anna Prescott, who had been composed and practical and careful for 26 years, kissed him back with everything she had. Her father came out of the barn approximately 30 seconds later, stopped, looked at them, and went back into the barn without saying a word. Stephen Monroe left that afternoon. He rode out with the 3 rangers from Austin, heading north and then east, and Anna stood at the fence line and watched until he was out of sight and then stood there a while longer because the landscape still felt like him somehow, like his presence had altered the quality of the air in a way that did not immediately dissipate. "He's a good man," her father said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she said. Thomas Prescott looked at his land. "This country needs good men," he said. "Doesn't leave them in one place for long." "No," she said, "it doesn't." He put his arm around her shoulders, briefly and without ceremony, the most demonstrative he had been in years, which she understood to mean that he had been more frightened during his 3 weeks of captivity than he was willing to say directly. "You were brave," he said. "Your mother would have found it entirely unsurprising." Anna had to press her lips together very hard for a moment. She would have found something to criticize, she said. "She would have found several things to criticize," Thomas Prescott agreed, "but she would have been enormously proud." They went in for supper. The weeks that followed were not quiet. Exactly the legal process that Stephen Monroe had set in motion moved forward with the slow grinding of official things. Depositions and documentation, and Halsey's attorney making various arguments that were being addressed one by one. And Anna was involved in it more than she might otherwise have been, because her father was not a man who navigated paperwork easily, and she was. She had also, in those weeks, made contact with the families who had been displaced. The Whitmans, Mrs. Garner, a family named Delacroix who had moved to the settlement at Red Fork, and had begun the process of helping them understand what the legal proceedings meant for the possibility of recovering what had been taken. It was slow work. It was not always encouraging work, but it was necessary work, and it was hers to do. She had also, in those weeks, found that she loved Texas. This had surprised her somewhat. She had expected to find it difficult, the heat, the scale of the landscape, the particular quality of hardship that came with frontier life, the distance from the world she had known. And it was difficult. It was genuinely and significantly difficult in ways that she respected and did not underestimate. But there was also something in it that answered something in her, the directness of the country, the absence of the layers of social performance that had overlaid everything in St. Louis, the sense of being in a place that was still in the process of becoming itself, where what you did mattered because there were not yet enough people and institutions to absorb the impact of individual choices. She had written to a school board in the settlement of Red Fork, asking about the possibility of a teaching position. They had responded with an eagerness that suggested the position had been unfilled for some time and had indeed needed filling. She had written to her landlady in St. Louis to arrange for her things to be shipped. She had written to Stephen Monroe, in care of the Ranger Post in Austin, because she did not have a more direct address, and because she had decided that waiting was not a virtue she was willing to cultivate indefinitely. His reply arrived 5 weeks after he had left. It was not long 2 pages in a handwriting that was, characteristically, clear and precise, but it was, in the way of the entire man, direct in a manner that left no ambiguity about what he meant. He was well. The legal situation had proceeded as he had anticipated. He was working a case in the hill country that was expected to conclude within the month. He had thought about her every day since leaving. He had spoken to his commanding officer about the possibility of a posting in the Caldwell region. He hoped she had not found Texas entirely inhospitable. He would come back in 6 weeks. He came back in 5. She was teaching a class of 11 children in the one-room schoolhouse that Red Fork had provided when he rode into the settlement on a Tuesday afternoon in July. She learned of this not because she saw him. She was occupied with long division and the competing enthusiasms of a boy named Eli who understood mathematics intuitively and found the pace of formal instruction deeply frustrating, but because the schoolhouse door opened and her student Martha, aged 10, said in a carrying whisper, "Miss Prescott, there is a man outside looking at the building." Anna had glanced out the window and seen the horse, recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. She had finished the class with what she considered admirable composure, let the children go, stepped outside into the blazing July afternoon. Stephen Monroe was leaning against the hitching rail with his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was his particular tell, the thing he did when he was uncertain, which was rarely, and the sight of it made her heart expand painfully in her chest. "You are early," she said. "The case resolved ahead of schedule," he said. "And the posting," she said. "Approved," he said. "Effective the 1st of August. I will be based in Caldwell," he paused, "provided that is agreeable." She looked at him standing in the July light. This man she had ridden across the badlands with. This man who had sat across the fire and watched her with everything he was trying not to say. This man who had put himself between her and harm, and cleaned her scrape with gentle hands, and kissed her outside her father's barn, and ridden away, and thought about her every day, and come back 5 weeks instead of 6, because he could not wait the extra week. And she thought that the word agreeable was about the most inadequate word she had encountered in 6 years of formal education. "It is more than agreeable," she said. He smiled then, the full, unguarded version, not the almost smile she had been cataloging for 10 days in the desert, but the real one, the one that changed his whole face, and she thought that she would spend considerable time and effort getting him to do that again. They courted properly, which in the summer of 1878 in Kansas Territory meant riding together on Sunday afternoons, and supper at the homestead with her father watching them with the particular alertness of a man pretending not to be watching, and the occasional dance in the settlement where the fiddle player was not technically skilled, but was enthusiastic enough to compensate, and letters when he was away for work, which happened with some regularity because being based in Caldwell did not mean staying in Caldwell, and the cases came as they came. She had written him once about the Delacroix family, who had been told that their claim to their previous land was unlikely to be legally recoverable even with Halsey's operation dismantled, because the paperwork Halsey had generated, however coercively obtained, was legally recorded and difficult to undo, and the machinery of official justice moved with a deliberate slowness that had particular costs for particular people. She had written about her frustration with this in terms she had not expected to use in a letter, direct and unsparing, because she had found that she could be direct with Stephen Monroe in a way she had never been able to be with anyone else, and that this was both a quality of him and something he had drawn out of her that had always been there waiting. He had written back, with the same careful directness, that she was right to be angry, that the injustice was real, that official processes had particular and documented failures when it came to the families most vulnerable to being displaced, that he had seen versions of this situation throughout his years of service, and had not always known what to do about it beyond the immediate case, and that her work with those families was worth more in practical terms than anything the legal proceedings were likely to achieve. He had also told her that he had spoken with two of the families himself on a trip through the region, and had pointed them toward a lawyer in Caldwell who was known for taking cases where the justice was clear even if the legal path was difficult. She had read that letter 3 times, not because it was romantic, it was not particularly, but because it was a man thinking alongside her about a thing that mattered to both of them, and that was more intimate than any conventional tenderness could have been. He asked her to marry him in September. They were sitting on the porch of the homestead in the early evening, the heat of the day finally relenting, the sky going pink and orange over the flat western horizon, and her father had gone inside with the studied tact of a man who had been reading the situation for 2 months, and had concluded that the situation was about to resolve itself, and that he should not be present when it did. Stephen Monroe had not made a production of it. He was not, constitutionally, a man who made productions of things. He had simply turned to her and said, with the directness that was his most fundamental quality, "Anna, I want to marry you. I want you to know that I mean a life. Not just a circumstance, not just a posting, a life, whatever that requires from both of us." She had looked at him in the pink evening light. "I know you have made arrangements here that are yours," he continued, "and I am not asking you to give any of them up, the school, the work with the families, whatever you want to do. I want to be the person who," he paused, turned his hat once in his hands, "who comes home to you, and who you come home to." Anna Prescott, who had been composed for 26 years, who had developed composure as a survival mechanism, and had never quite been able to put it down, looked at Stephen Monroe on her father's porch in the September evening and felt composure become entirely irrelevant. "Yes," she said. They were married in November, in the settlement church at Red Fork, which was not large but was full, because Anna had been teaching in that community for 4 months and had accumulated the goodwill that teachers accumulate in small communities, where they are genuinely good at what they do and genuinely care about the people they are doing it for. Her father stood beside her. Stephen Monroe's sister, a woman named Clara who had come from Central Texas and who was warm and direct in a way that made it immediately evident she and Stephen were from the same family, stood on Anna's other side. Thomas Prescott cried during the ceremony. Not obviously, not in any way he would acknowledge afterward, but Anna saw it and catalogued it alongside the other things she catalogued about her father, the evidence of love in a man who expressed it indirectly, who built solid fences and made good coffee, and would not leave his good boots behind even when someone was trying to take everything from him. The legal matter with Halsey concluded the following spring. Cord Halsey was indicted on charges that included unlawful detention, criminal coercion, and fraudulent land acquisition. The proceedings were long and complicated, and Halsey's attorney was expensive and skilled, but the documentation that Stephen Monroe had built with such meticulous care held up, and the testimony of the families, the Whitmans, Mrs. Garner, the Delacroix, Thomas Prescott, and several others who had emerged once the proceedings made coming forward seem less immediately dangerous, was damning in its accumulated weight. Halsey received a prison sentence that was not as long as Anna thought it should have been. This was frustrating and expected. 2 of his men, including Driscoll, received longer sentences, which was a different kind of justice than the primary one, but was still justice of a sort. The land that could be legally recovered was recovered. Some of the families came back. Some did not. They had rebuilt elsewhere, made new lives, and the land they had left was no longer the same place it had been for them, which was itself a form of loss that no court proceeding could address. Anna wrote about this in a letter to the editor of the Caldwell newspaper. She wrote clearly and carefully, and with the full weight of what she had witnessed, and the full force of her anger at the inadequacy of the remedy relative to the wrong. The letter was published, and it was not entirely comfortable to read, and it was talked about in certain rooms in ways that were not entirely comfortable either, and she had thought that her mother, who had been forthright and inconvenient in ways that had created friction in Illinois in the 1860s, would indeed have found something to criticize but would also have been proud. Stephen Monroe had read the published letter at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment after finishing it, and then looked up at her with the gray-green eyes and said, "You are going to continue to be a great deal of trouble for comfortable people." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his coffee. She had loved him so much in that moment that it had been almost painful. The way extreme things sometimes are, the quality of light on a particular day, the smell of a particular season, the sense of a life that is fully inhabited and fully yours. Their son was born in the summer of 1880, and they named him Thomas James Monroe, Thomas for her father and James for Stephen's father. And Thomas Prescott came to stay at the house for a month after the birth, and was quietly and absolutely undone by his grandson in the way that certain stern and private people are undone by small children. The armor simply does not apply. The child simply walks through it without noticing it is there. Thomas James Monroe was, from the beginning, an emphatic child, loud and vigorous and convinced of his own perspective, with a certainty that his grandfather found familiar in a rueful way, and his parents found both exhausting and wonderful. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn directness, and he was Anna's absolute delight and her greatest daily challenge, which she thought was probably what good love always was. Stephen was a father with the same quality he brought to everything: thoughtful, steady, present in the way that meant something because it was not incidental but chosen, the presence of a man who understood that showing up mattered and showed up accordingly. He had continued his work with the Rangers, the posting in Caldwell renewed and eventually made permanent, and he was away sometimes. This was the nature of the work and it did not change, but the coming home was always the coming home that he had promised on the porch in September, complete and certain. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Eleanor, which had been Stephen's mother's name, and Eleanor Monroe came into the world with a determined quietness that was very different from her brother's emphatic entry, and that turned out to be not quietness at all but concentration. She watched everything with a focused attention that her father recognized immediately, and her mother found both amusing and slightly unnerving. Anna had gone back to teaching the previous year, 2 days a week initially and then 3, because the school at Red Fork needed her, and because she needed the school, the children, the work of helping them understand things, the daily confrontation with the world as it looked to someone encountering it freshly. Her father, who had recovered his land and his independence and his routine with the completeness of a man who did not allow disruption to become permanent, came to look after the children on the days she taught, and this arrangement suited everyone and created between Thomas Prescott and his grandchildren a bond that Anna watched with a fullness in her chest that sometimes made it difficult to breathe. By 1883, the territory was changing. The wildness of the earlier years was not gone. It was not going to be gone for some time, but there was a different quality to the settlement now, more permanence, more structure, the slow accumulation of institutions that make a place less frontier and more community. Churches with real buildings and not just sod walls, a proper school, a bank, 2 competing newspapers, a doctor who had trained properly and had a real office and not just a traveling bag. Anna had played a part in some of this. She had organized parents around the school question, had written letters and attended meetings, and argued consistently and precisely for the importance of education in a place where it was still too easy to treat it as optional. She had helped Mrs. Garner navigate a land dispute with the patience and attention to detail that she had first developed in that careful way that grief requires of the people it visits. She had, without quite intending it, become someone the community brought its complicated problems to. Stephen Monroe watched this happen with what she had come to recognize as his characteristic response to things that moved him, a very still attentiveness, the expression that looked neutral until you knew him well enough to read it. He said things about it rarely and only when what he said would be specific and true rather than generally supportive, which was his way, and which she had long ago come to prefer to the more conventional alternative. One evening, in the fall of 1883, they had put both children to bed and were sitting on the porch in the cooling evening air, a porch they had built themselves, with her father's help and considerable advice, extended from the small house they had acquired in Red Fork that had grown over the years in the incremental way of houses that are actively lived in, and the stars were beginning to appear over the Texas country. And the air smelled of cedar and dry grass, and the particular smell of autumn in this landscape that she had come to know as completely as she had once known the smell of coal smoke and river mud. And Stephen Monroe reached over and took her hand, and held it, and said nothing, in the way he had said nothing across the fire on the 7th night in the desert, but with an entirely different kind of silence. "What are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way she knew was consideration rather than evasion. "I am thinking," he said, "that 5 years ago I rode into Caldwell on a wire from a sheriff who didn't want to handle his own case, and I walked into an office, and there was a woman sitting across a desk who looked at me like she had already decided exactly what she thought of me and was waiting to see if I would confirm it or surprise her." Anna smiled at the dark. "And I am thinking," he continued, "that I have thought about that moment a great deal, because the number of moments in a life that change its direction entirely is not large, and I am fairly certain that was one of mine." She turned to look at him. In the starlight he was the same angular, steady, the particular quality of containment that had drawn her eye in that office, and had not stopped drawing her eye in 5 years. "I thought you were going to be one of those men who treated me like a problem to be managed," she said. "You spent about 40 minutes deciding that I wasn't," he said. "You asked me 11 questions and actually listened to the answers," she said. "That was considerable." He laughed quietly, the laugh that was rare and entirely worth waiting for. 11, he said. "You counted." "I count things," she said. "It is a quality I have had since childhood and have not been able to cure myself of." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to it briefly, warmly, in the way he had of expressing things that he did not choose to put into words, not because the words did not exist, but because the gesture was more precise. "I would not cure it if I could," he said. They sat in the evening for a while longer, the children asleep inside, the stars coming in fully now, the land around them dark and present, and theirs in the way that the places you have made your life in become yours. Anna thought about the fire in the desert, 7 days in, the silence that had been so full of everything unsaid. She thought about the morning after, riding toward Halsey's range with the plan that was not a good plan but was what they had. She thought about her father's boots by the door, which had been the thing that broke her open in a house full of evidence of his absence. She thought about the 11 questions in the sheriff's office, the feel of his hands cleaning the scrape on her arm, the almost smiles she had catalogued like pressing flowers small, precious, rare. She thought about what it meant to build a life with a person who was precisely himself, without performance or embellishment, who told you difficult truths because he believed you capable of handling them, who put himself between you and harm without hesitation and without making a spectacle of it, who came home always the way he had promised. "Stephen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you answered that wire," she said. He squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said, and the simplicity of it was the truest thing either of them had said in a long time, which was saying something, because they were both people who tried to say true things. The autumn deepened around them. Inside the house, Thomas James Monroe, age 3, was sleeping with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never doubted that the world will be there in the morning. And Eleanor Monroe, 14 months old, was sleeping with the focused quietness that was already so entirely her own. Thomas Prescott was at his homestead, alive and well, and working his land with the implacable stubbornness that had kept it his through everything that had tried to take it. The stars were enormous over Texas, the way they always were, the kind of stars that remind you of the scale of things without making you feel small, or not always small, and not only small. Anna Prescott Monroe sat on her porch in the fall of 1883 holding her husband's hand in the dark, and thought that she had come west for her father and had found considerably more than she had come looking for, and that this was the kind of truth the territory kept about itself, that it looked harsh and it was also, for the people who chose to meet it fully, quietly, and irreversibly magnificent. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. He put his arm around her, and she felt the warmth of him against the night air, and they watched the stars together over the country they had both chosen, the country that had made them necessary to each other in ways neither of them had anticipated on the morning they first sat across a sheriff's desk in Caldwell with a missing man and an uncertain road between them. In the spring of 1884, Anna discovered she was expecting again. She told Stephen on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the window, and he had gone very still in the way he went still for things of significance. And then he had crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time without speaking, and she had felt the steadiness of him, the particular quality of a man who is deeply moved and deeply certain simultaneously, and had thought, as she often thought, that there was nobody else in the world she would rather have beside her for the difficult and wonderful things. Their second son was born in October, as the weather turned and the mesquite began to lose its leaves. They named him William, which had no family significance but which both of them simply agreed was the right name for him, in the way that some things are simply and immediately right. William Monroe was quieter than his brother and more deliberate, but there was something in him that was all his own, a stubbornness that even at a few weeks of age was evident in the set of his jaw, which made Thomas Prescott look at his newest grandson and say, with a dry satisfaction, "Good." Thomas James was 4 by then, and had opinions about the new baby that he expressed at length and with great specificity, most of them positive, some of them concerned about the redistribution of parental attention that a new sibling necessarily entailed, all of them exactly the kind of thing you would expect from a child who had inherited directness from both sides of his family. Eleanor, at 2, regarded William with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and within several weeks had appointed herself his dedicated observer, watching him with a seriousness that made the adults in the room try not to smile too obviously. Life in Red Fork settled into the rhythms that good lives settle into, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of living in a place that was still finding its shape, but with a fundamental texture of rightness that Anna had not known she was looking for when she left St. Louis with a leather satchel and a folded letter, and that she had found in this improbable place with this particular man. Stephen Monroe continued his work with the Rangers, the posting permanent now, his reputation in the territory that of a man who was quietly and thoroughly relied upon, not a dramatic figure, not the kind of lawman that the dime novels celebrated, but the kind that communities actually needed, the kind that was present and consistent and whose word meant something because he had never given anyone reason to doubt it. He came home always, the way he had promised. That was the center of it, the constant around which everything else moved. In the evenings, sometimes, they would sit on the porch after the children were in bed and watch the Texas sky, and she would lean against him, and he would put his arm around her, and the silence between them would be exactly the right kind of silence. The silence of two people who have said enough that silence is not empty but full. The silence of the desert on the 7th night transformed into something permanent and warm and entirely theirs. She thought sometimes about that fire, the crackling and the amber light, and the way he had looked at her across it with everything unsaid. She thought that was where it began, in the space between the saying and the not saying, in the decision to mean something without quite speaking it, in the staying awake on either side of a fire in the middle of nowhere, because neither of them could bear to stop being in the same space. She thought, that is where we were made. And the land held them, and the years moved through them. And Anna Prescott Monroe taught her children and her students to read the world carefully and speak of it honestly. And Stephen Monroe came home from each case to the house with the porch and the Texas stars and the woman who had looked at him in a sheriff's office, and decided, in 40 minutes, that he was not what she had expected. He had not, in the years since, given her any reason to revise that conclusion. She had not given him any reason to regret coming back. It was, by all the available measures, exactly the life they had chosen, and it was exactly enough. And on the best evenings, the clear autumn evenings and the cool spring mornings, and the long summer twilights when the children were finally asleep, and the stars were coming in over the cedar and the mesquite and the red earth of a country that had asked them both to be fully themselves and had given them each other in return, it was a great deal more than enough. It was everything.